What would you do if you saw a police officer slap a child in front of their own father? Now, imagine the father isn't just any ordinary man, but the chief of police. This is exactly what happened when a racist cop crossed a line, completely unaware of the consequences that were about to unfold. What followed next would not only shock the entire department, but change everything for this cop forever. This wasn't just a case of racism, it was an unforgivable mistake that would cost one cop everything. The power of this man's identity would lead to an unexpected twist that nobody saw coming. Have you ever witnessed an act of injustice like this? What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The fallout of this moment would be so much bigger than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive in, let us know in the comment, where are you watching from? Charles Thompson was the chief of police in a small town. Respected, powerful, and trusted by the community, he had built his career through dedication and hard work. His name carried weight. But there was one thing not many people knew. He was a father, and his love for his son, Jordan, was his top priority. No matter how busy his career made him, his son always came first. But that day, everything was about to change. Officer James Dawson was new to the department. On the surface, he was just another cop trying to prove himself, eager to earn respect. But there was something deeper lurking beneath the surface. His racist tendencies, a bias that had shaped his worldview for years. That afternoon, those deep-seated feelings would come to light in a way Dawson couldn't have anticipated. It was a warm afternoon when Charles and Jordan decided to spend some time together in the park. Laughing, chatting, and enjoying each other's company, they were completely unaware of what was about to unfold. As they neared a group of kids, Officer Dawson, patrolling nearby, noticed Jordan and started walking toward them. The tension began to build, and neither Charles nor Jordan had any idea what would come next. From the moment Dawson locked eyes with Jordan, something felt off. His judgment clouded his every action. What he didn't know was that the man watching him, just a few feet away, was the chief of police, the very person in charge of the town. Dawson, without any real reason, started to challenge Jordan. The young boy, confused but still confident, didn't respond how Dawson expected. The cop's temper flared. "You think you're better than everyone else," he snapped, stepping forward and pushing Jordan roughly. Jordan took a step back, his face showing nothing but confusion. But Charles, standing just a few feet away, felt the tension rise. Dawson was about to escalate things. Without warning, Dawson raised his hand and slapped Jordan across the face. The sound of it echoed through the park, louder than anything Charles had ever heard. Time seemed to freeze. Jordan stumbled slightly, eyes wide, his hand instinctively touching his cheek. Charles stood motionless. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. His son, the child he raised with love, was being hit in front of him. Rage built inside Charles, but it was mixed with disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Dawson, unaware of who Charles was, didn't stop. He seemed ready to escalate even further. The moment felt like it was slipping out of control, but Charles remained frozen for just a second. His son, his family, was being disrespected in front of him, and a part of Charles wanted to explode. Charles stood still, the world around him seeming to blur. He couldn't believe it. A cop, someone he'd worked with, someone who wore the same badge, was hitting his son. His body trembled with fury, but he was holding back. Dawson didn't know who he was dealing with. Charles' power, his reputation, meant nothing now. What mattered was respect for his family, and that had just been shattered. Without thinking, Charles took a step forward. His voice was low but firm, icy with controlled anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Dawson, still not recognizing Charles, scoffed, brushing it off. "I'm disciplining this kid," Dawson said dismissively, as if that was enough. Charles knew he couldn't let this go. This wasn't just a momentary lapse. It was an unforgivable act. Dawson had no right to hit Jordan, and no matter how much he tried to justify it, there was only one thing left for Charles to do. Slowly, Charles reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against his badge. As soon as Dawson saw it, his face drained of color. His eyes widened in disbelief, but it was too late. "You're under arrest," Charles said, his tone as cold as ice. Dawson's arrogant stance melted into panic. He stammered, "You can't be serious." Charles didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let Dawson talk his way out of this. "You made a huge mistake," Charles said, his words controlled, deliberate. Dawson's arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a fear Charles had never seen before. The realization hit Dawson. He had just slapped the wrong kid, the son of the chief of police. And now, the consequences would be unimaginable. Charles didn't care about his power or status right now. What mattered was the respect for his family, his son. He wouldn't let this injustice slide. As Dawson tried to sputter out an excuse, Charles's voice cut through the noise. "It's over. You crossed the line." Dawson's eyes were wide, and the reality of the situation finally hit him. He was staring down the man who controlled everything in this town, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. As Charles looked at Dawson, he realized how deep the issue ran. It wasn't just about a single rogue cop. It was about a deep-rooted problem that needed to be addressed. Dawson had been the part of the system that allowed this behavior to thrive. Charles was still fuming, but he wasn't just angry at Dawson. He was angry at himself for letting things go this far. He was angry that even in a position of power, he hadn't done more to fix the systemic issues he knew existed. But today, he had the chance to do something about it. Dawson's racism, his arrogance, couldn't be ignored any longer. Charles continued, his voice steady, but the fire in his words was undeniable. "You'll answer for this, not just because you hit my son, but because you think you're above everyone else. The system doesn't work like that, Dawson, not anymore." Dawson stood there, paralyzed, as the weight of the situation finally hit him. He knew his career, his future, was over. This wasn't just about a slap. It was about a man in power using his authority to hurt an innocent child. And now, Charles would make sure Dawson paid the price. Dawson was led away in cuffs, but Charles couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. It wasn't about one cop anymore. It was about everything that had led to this moment, the deep-seated racism that had been allowed to persist under the guise of authority. As Charles watched Dawson being escorted out, he knew he had done the right thing. But there was still so much more to be done. The anger, the hurt, it was still there. But now he had to figure out what to do next. He couldn't let this moment slip away without making sure it was a turning point. For Jordan, for the community, for everyone. Dawson had made the biggest mistake of his life by slapping the wrong child. But the true consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. The ripple effects would be felt throughout the department, through the town and in every corner where racism had been allowed to fester unchecked. The tension was unbearable. Charles, as calm as he tried to be, could feel his heart racing in his chest. Dawson had just slapped his son, and it didn't matter who he was or what badge he wore. He wasn't going to get away with this. "You've made a huge mistake," Charles said, his voice trembling with barely controlled anger. It wasn't just the physical slap. It was the disrespect, the cruelty, the unjustified arrogance. "You don't touch my family, not like that. Not ever." His words were heavy, and Dawson's cocky demeanor evaporated as he started to grasp the gravity of the situation. The shock was written all over Dawson's face. It was as if he had just realized the mistake he had made, and suddenly he understood that there was no excuse for his actions. He had misjudged the situation. He had misjudged Charles. And now, the reality of what he had done was starting to sink in. He had no idea that the man standing before him, the father of the boy he had just slapped, was the chief of police. That mistake was going to cost him everything. As Charles moved to arrest him, Dawson's face morphed into one of panic and fear. "Wait," he said, suddenly pleading. "Please, don't do this. It was just a mistake, okay? I didn't mean to." But Charles wasn't listening. He had heard enough of the excuses. He was done with the justifications. The time for pleading had passed. Dawson had hurt his son, and no amount of begging was going to change that. There was no way to undo what had been done. Charles' jaw tightened as he moved to cuff Dawson, but then he paused for a moment, his eyes flicking to his son, Jordan. He saw the shock still on his face, the way his son was still processing what had just happened. Jordan's face was flushed with anger, but there were tears in his eyes too. The slap had done more than hurt him physically. It had cut deeper than that. Charles' heart ached. This wasn't how he had envisioned spending the afternoon with his son. He had hoped for a peaceful day together, but instead they were faced with this. The emotional weight of it hit him hard. He looked back at Dawson, still standing before him, trembling. Charles couldn't help but wonder how long this kind of thing had been happening in his town. How long had he been blind to the actions of officers like Dawson? Was this how the town saw his family, his son? Was this how it was for Jordan, even now? Had his son's world been shaped by these kinds of injustices? The realization that this could happen in his town, under his watch, made Charles feel a deep sense of failure. For a moment, he wanted to let the situation go, to forgive and move forward, to somehow believe that Dawson was truly remorseful. But he knew that if he did that, if he let Dawson off easy, the message it would send to Jordan, to the whole town, would be worse than the slap itself. This couldn't be swept under the rug. This wasn't just about a slap. It was about everything Dawson represented. It was about the system of inequality that had allowed him to feel entitled to act this way. And it was about showing everyone, including his son, that there would be consequences for actions like these. Charles turned his attention back to Dawson, who was still standing there, now trembling with fear. His face was pale, his mouth dry, and it was clear that he finally realized the full scope of his mistake. "This isn't over," Charles said, his voice chilling. "You've crossed a line, and now you're going to pay for it." Dawson stood there, his legs weak, his body unable to hide his panic. The defiance was gone, replaced by the clear understanding that his career, his future, was hanging by a thread. Dawson's eyes were wide, and it took him a moment to fully grasp the situation. He had just slapped the wrong kid, an innocent boy, And the father of that boy wasn't just anyone. He was the chief of police, the most powerful man in town. Dawson had crossed a line he could never come back from. Charles could see the realization hit Dawson like a truck. His arrogant attitude had disappeared, and all that was left was fear. The grip of justice was closing in on him. But Charles wasn't just doing this because Dawson had hurt his son. It was because of everything that this moment represented. Dawson's action wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much bigger problem, one that Charles had been turning a blind eye to for too long, but no more. This was his chance to set things right. "Your career is over," Charles said, his words slow and deliberate, ensuring Dawson understood the weight of them. "You've abused your power, and now you'll answer for it." Dawson opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was too afraid to say anything, knowing that whatever he said wouldn't change the inevitable. The law was clear, and now Charles was in charge of it. The tension between them felt suffocating, but Charles didn't let up. This wasn't about revenge, it was about responsibility. He couldn't let someone like Dawson continue to serve as a representative of the law. A man like that was a danger, and Charles couldn't allow him to tarnish the reputation of the force, of the town, or of his own family. As the police arrived to take Dawson into custody, Charles stood tall, his gaze never wavering from the officer who had thought he was untouchable. But now, Dawson was just another man, facing the consequences of his own actions. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was a criminal, and Charles would make sure the town knew it. Looking at his son, Charles couldn't help but feel the weight of the lesson that had just been delivered. Jordan didn't need to hear words. He didn't need a speech about justice. What he needed was to see that no matter how big or small, right or wrong, there would always be a consequence for actions like Dawson's. And today, Charles had made sure that there would be justice for Jordan, for himself, and for the community. As Dawson was driven away, Charles turned to his son, whose face was still filled with anger and confusion. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Jordan nodded, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Charles pulled him into a hug, feeling a mix of emotions. They had just witnessed a painful moment of injustice, but they had also witnessed what happens when that injustice is confronted head-on. This wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't over. There would be more work to do, more to fix. But for now, Charles knew one thing for sure. His son was watching, and he had just shown him what it meant to stand up for what was right. The moment Dawson was cuffed and taken away, the full impact of what had just happened hit Charles. This wasn't just about a rogue officer acting out. No, it was much bigger than that. This was a deep-rooted issue, one that had been festering for years. Dawson wasn't the only one with bias. The whole town had been built on it, on whispers, on unspoken rules, on a culture that had long been blind to the truth. Charles' mind raced as the realization hit him like a brick wall. His power, his influence, couldn't change everything. He couldn't fix a broken system overnight. As Dawson was led to the squad car, Charles stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his body tense with the weight of it all. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was a systemic problem, one that stretched far beyond Dawson's actions. Charles had been so focused on his job, on climbing the ranks, that he had ignored the signs. He had hoped the town's issues would just work themselves out. But standing there, seeing Dawson arrested for the slap that changed everything, Charles knew that the true fight had just begun. The anger he felt for Dawson was nothing compared to the frustration he now had for himself. He had spent years in law enforcement, years running the department, but he had never truly looked at the culture that had been allowed to thrive. He had been so caught up in appearances, in maintaining order, that he had never questioned the underlying problems. The town's problems. Dawson had been the catalyst, yes, but Charles understood now that his arrest wasn't going to be the end of it. It was only the beginning. He could arrest every officer with a bias, but that wouldn't change the town's mentality. That wouldn't change how people thought, how they treated each other. Charles realized that as long as the system remained the same, there would always be more officers like Dawson. And maybe, just maybe, there were people within his own department who shared Dawson's views but hid behind the badge. As Charles watched Dawson being led away, his mind flashed back to all the times he had turned a blind eye. The time he'd let a questionable arrest slide. The times he had dismissed complaints from people in the community because it was easier to pretend everything was fine. The power he had once thought would be enough to fix everything now felt like a weight, pulling him deeper into the very problem he had been avoiding for years. But there was more. Dawson wasn't just some outlier, some unfortunate exception. No, he was a product of the system. The same system Charles had helped build, the same system he had been a part of for so long. Watching Dawson, now sitting in the back of a police car with his face drained of color, Charles knew something more profound. He wasn't just fighting for his son's dignity anymore. He wasn't just fighting to make sure that his family wasn't wronged. He was fighting for justice, for everyone, for all the people who had been hurt, dismissed, or oppressed by the very system that was supposed to protect them, for the people like Dawson, who had allowed racism and bias to dictate their actions without ever realizing the damage they were causing, for the people who had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid to stand up to the system, to the officers who thought their badge gave them the right to harm anyone they deemed beneath them. The fight wasn't over yet. It couldn't be, not when there was so much more to be done. Charles knew that this moment, this one single act, wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long, difficult road ahead. As the squad car drove away, Charles stood alone in the parking lot, his mind spinning. He had been so focused on keeping the peace, on running the department, that he had overlooked the most important part of his job: real change, real accountability. And now he was finally realizing that his responsibility went beyond just the people he served. It was about his actions. It was about how he used his position, his influence, to create a better future for the town. Charles turned to face his son, who had been watching from a distance. Jordan's expression was a mix of anger, confusion, and hurt. The slap had changed something in him, something that would be hard to forget. But Charles didn't want his son to only remember the pain. He wanted Jordan to see that even in the face of injustice, there was power in standing up, in making sure the right thing was done. "Are you okay?" Charles asked softly, his voice strained with emotion. Jordan nodded, but didn't say anything. There were no easy words to say after what had just happened. Charles took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of his responsibilities more than ever before. The guilt he felt was overwhelming. He had allowed things to get this far, but now he had a choice. He had the power to make sure things changed. He couldn't fix everything, but he could start by ensuring that this town, his department, would never let something like this happen again. He could lead by example. He could teach his son what it truly meant to fight for justice, to stand up even when it seemed impossible. The truth hit Charles hard. This wasn't just about Dawson. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the culture, the systemic issues that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive. The only way to fix it was to start from the top and work down. It was going to be difficult, and it was going to take time. But Charles now understood that he had a responsibility, both as a father and as the chief of police, to change the system from within. As he looked at his son, he knew this moment would stay with them forever. But it wasn't just about what happened today. It was about what came next. It was about making sure this moment, this terrible, painful moment, would spark a change that would last a lifetime. And with that, Charles made a vow to himself. He wasn't going to let Dawson be the only casualty of this moment. He wasn't going to let this injustice go unnoticed. Dawson's mistake had ignited something in Charles, a fire that would drive him to do everything he could to fix what had been broken for so long. Charles wasn't just fighting for his son anymore. He was fighting for his town, for every person who had been wronged, and for the future he wanted to build. The real fight had only just begun. In the end, this wasn't just about what happened that day. It was about the choices we make and how they define us. The moment Charles stood up to Dawson wasn't just about a slap. It was about the message it sent. Sometimes, the lines between right and wrong blur in the most unexpected ways. The world isn't always as simple as we want it to be, and that's what makes decisions so hard. Justice, in this case, wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about simply paying for one bad act. It was about accountability. It was about self-reflection and understanding the deeper consequences of our actions, not just in the moment, but over time. What do you think about what happened? Have you ever been in a situation where the line between family and something else got blurred? It's hard to recognize and even harder to accept. But that's when we grow the most. When we realize our choices don't just affect us, but everyone around us. What's the most difficult part about recognizing and accepting that? Sometimes it's hard to admit that the things we ignore can come back and affect us in ways we never expected. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts with us, and let's talk about the deeper issues at play. This story isn't just a one-time lesson. It's about bigger questions, self-reflection, and the change we all need. More stories of self-reflection, change, and confronting difficult truths are coming your way. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one.